Can Samsung's new Galaxy S23 Ultra live up to the hype? We go hands-on to find out.
And what effect will government funding have on the local games development industry? Hey there. Welcome back to Vertical Hole Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as usual by Alex Kidman. Now, Alex, we've all been forced to tighten our belts as interest rates soar and the economy cools. What's the one extravagance that you'd rather starve than go without?
Well, look, I'm tempted to say vertical hold behind the tech news, but obviously that award-winning podcast, which people should subscribe to, is free, so it's not an extravagance. It's entirely affordable. And instead, I've got to go down the obvious route and say retro video games. Luckily, I own nearly everything that I want, and everything that I don't have is so stupidly expensive that I can't even bring myself to buy them, even if we were living in less constrained economic times.
So while Alex weighs up if he can sell all of his cars to buy one of those old games, we're also joined by an old friend of the show. It's Lee Stark from Picker. Lee, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
So times are tough. Which vice is more important to you than paying the power bill?
Buying books for my girls is a lot more important than paying for the power bill.
Reading them by candlelight?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can use the light on my iPhone. I just have to work out how to charge it up.
Economic woes aside, Lee's here because it's Galaxy launch week, and we're going to discuss whether or not Samsung's new flagships really compete in the pricey flagship space. But before we blow all of our cash on shiny new smartphones, the federal government is busy spending our tax dollars on video games. Hang on, Alex, is that right? What's the story there?
So a lot of Australians play video games, but a much smaller proportion of Australians actually make video games. The Australian video game industry is one that's had a really storied history, and this week the Australian government announced some new but sort of not really new funding initiatives. We're joined by Matt Sainsbury from digitallydownloaded.net. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me on again.
So the core of this new funding initiative is, I think, $12 million to fund independent games development. Now, $12 million, if you gave that to me, I'd think, wow, that's a lot of money. In the gaming space, though, it's not that big a sum, is it?
No, and it's really kind of a restoration of what the previous Labor government had implemented before they got kind of bundled out, and the Liberal National Party then got rid of that funding. So it really is just a restoration of what was already there, and that's kind of the extent of the support that the games industry has had. It does fund a decent number of games, I would say, and there have been quite a few really popular games that came out of that previous fund. So the money will certainly result in some good quality stuff. But yeah, whether it's a huge amount or not, and whether it's going to be enough to build the industry from where it is another question.
Have they defined what they mean by independent games? How small, how big you are before you're eligible for the money?
Yeah, I don't believe that has happened yet. If it's anything like the previous one, you'd be looking at development teams of maybe up to 10, 15 people, I think, which was kind of the upper limit of the size of the teams that were actually getting access to this. They do have another funding, well, it's not really a funding initiative. They do have another initiative to assist larger developers. Not that we have many of those in Australia, but there is a tax offset that's also been brought in as part of this cultural investment that they're making. And that is more targeted towards the larger end of town, and particularly to encourage kind of overseas developers to set up studios for 50, 100, 150, whatever number of people in Australia.
So what about solo developers sitting at home in their bedroom? Are they likely to get a taste of this? What do they need to do to qualify?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there are a lot of kind of small developers there. I don't know if they're going to be able to access much money through this fund, and I don't know if they'll be able to create the kind of games that I think this fund is designed to finance. I mean, you're talking about I'm going to name drop games that people who don't play video games probably don't aren't too familiar with, but the likes of Armello and Hand of Fate were really the kind of games that were funded by this previously. And I would imagine that the goal of this is to continue to fund those kinds of games.
The local scene, though, I mean, of late, and certainly I'm going to say the last decade, has been that independent game story, though, hasn't it? Because we had some AAA studios, they got bought up by the likes of Sega and others, and then that all sort of collapsed. And I mean, a lot of the more recent big hit games, your Goose games, your Cult of the Lamb, they've come out of small teams, haven't they?
Yeah, very small teams. I think the Cult game was only a couple of people. Goose game was just 2 or 3, I think. It was a very small team as well. And you're right, we don't have those big studios anymore. What happened was the GFC hit all those years ago, and basically the idea of using Australia as an outsourcing location for supporting development kind of died, and with that, the local arms of a lot of these large publishers went as well. We haven't got that back. And I would say that while the tax break is probably the tax credit or whatever they're calling it is probably designed to help to try and bring that back, I don't think that that's going to be the case. I think the future of the games industry in Australia is certainly going to be those smaller developers that will eventually grow to mid-size and perhaps get acquired from there.
So are there other bodies that are offering funding? I seem to recall that, I want to say Film Victoria, someone like that, was doing a bit of games funding as well.
Yes, Film Victoria has always been quite positive with the games industry, and they do some, and they will continue to, as far as I'm aware, continue to do some funding for the games industry at a state level. And that is why the games industry, as concentrated as it is kind of concentrated in Melbourne. That's where the bulk of the studios are. Goose Game and the Cult of the Land, they all came out of Melbourne.
Yeah.
So that they are very much a forward-thinking group in terms of the games industry, and that's certainly I would hope that's going to continue, even despite even with the kind of the funding from the Australian government coming in.
This is part of a much broader and bigger cultural fund that the government is putting together. And with an eye towards independent games development, and I'm sure you'll have an opinion on this, Matt, is that smaller indie games development where we should be chasing, or should we be chasing those bigger AAA dollars?
Well, I think that is it definitely should be more orientated towards those smaller developers. Firstly, they need the assistance perhaps more in terms of being able to build a sustainable business. It is more difficult when you're a tiny developer of a couple of people as opposed to having the backing of a large corporation. And I do think as well that the Australian stories, which is what I took out of the cultural announcement, the goal was to encourage more Australian stories to come through. Those will come from those smaller developers. The big guys, if Activision or Microsoft or Sony or whoever sets up a studio in Australia, they're going to be much more focused on creating those blockbuster games which don't really have a cultural identity. Whereas I think the smaller developers are the ones that will be finding Australian stories to tell. And as far as the chances of us building the games industry up to being able to do that, we're better off focusing our energy on the small teams.
How has the game industry fared over the last couple of years? Because in some way you could look at it and say, well, a lot of people are stuck at home in their bedrooms. I'm sure some good things would have come out of that. But overall, what kind of health is the games industry in at the moment?
It's difficult. It does seem to be that we still have trouble sustaining businesses once they get to a certain size. So I mentioned earlier Hand of Fate, which was a very popular game. It got a sequel as well, which I believe did well enough. But that developer is no longer with us. And that seems to be the story, that you get to a certain point and it becomes very difficult for you to continue on as a developer. I think on the creative side of things, the Australian developers are doing some great work. And we're getting all kinds of those cultural hits that resonate across the world, like Untitled Goose Game and whatever. I feel like we're very good at producing those, but when it comes time to kind of try and scale to having a larger presence and having developers creating those games that are more competitive on that scale, I think we still have some structural issues.
So we're a long way from Grand Theft Goose then.
Yes. As much as I would love Grand Theft Goose, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, the last time we tried to
do you have copyright on that? Like, we might have just come up with a great idea there.
I hear there's an independent games fund out there. Maybe we can
I think we just found our new sponsor.
The last time we tried to create a game of that scale was LA Noire, which was a game that was plagued with all kinds of development challenges. They did get the game out at the end, but the studio didn't survive that one release. So that again it points to a kind of structural issue with the ability for game developers in Australia to scale. And I feel like the Cultural Fund doesn't really acknowledge that, and that's kind of my main issue with it as such. It has a lot of great ideas, and it obviously has the intention to fund game development in the country. But as to whether it addresses the real issues that are kind of sitting underneath, I don't think it gets there.
So I'm curious on this actually, because I'm concerned, in a sense, Australian small games developers can often come up with really great out there concepts. I mean, Goose Game's a great concept, Colour of the Lamb's a great concept, but I can't imagine trying to sell it to an EA or an Ubisoft as a concept. They'd look at it and just go, no, that's just too strange. It's too out there. And I'm also thinking of much older titles like Escape from Woomera, which, of course, never actually got funded because it was seen as too politically sensitive. Do you think there's a risk with funds like this that someone's going to say, yes, here's my concept for, small fluffy kitten massacre simulator, and then suddenly there's going to be a huge, cultural or media blowback on why are we funding this thing for the video games for the kiddies kind of thing?
Yeah, I guess that's always a risk with any fund. You could say the same of Screen Australia funding a film that goes south in some way and ends up becoming controversial, perhaps for reasons that the filmmakers didn't necessarily intend. I feel like because they are pitching, I mean, the development teams that will be pitching for this funding will be teams of 5-10 people. There is a greater risk, I guess, that they haven't focus grouped whether it's going to cause some kind of blowback. But as to whether that then kind of impacts on the government and its willingness to continue to invest in these things, I don't know. I would suggest not. I would hope that the underlying idea of all of this is to encourage creativity, and sometimes creative ideas do end up being controversial, but who knows?
In some industries, they talk about like a brain drain because people get to a certain level and then they get lured away overseas where there are more opportunities and there's more money. Is that the kind of thing that happens here, or are there other things that happen that mean that we don't have that proper pipeline of people coming up through because at a certain point they either leave the industry or get lured away somewhere else?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the main structural issue that we have with the Australian games industry, that from when you finish your schooling and you get your first job in the games industry right through to the point where you're producing and directing those large games, that pipeline is very constricted. There aren't too many opportunities to promote yourself or to move up through the ranks as such, and you don't get the chances of working at those large developers to get the skills in terms of managing large projects as well. So one of the big problems we had when we lost all of those big studios was that we didn't have the chance to develop veterans, I guess, of the industry who could then go away and start their own small studios and start to grow that way. So a lot of that did go overseas, and there isn't much. There isn't much in this package in terms of of offering something to bring them back. And whether I can't see anything at the moment as turning that around. We also have issues with visas as well in getting talent from overseas to come to Australia, whether local talent will bringing them back. So
the IGA put out a fairly positive sort of statement around the fund. Do you think that's just a case of them being happy because there's at least something in the kitty, or should they be fighting for more?
Well, they have got what they've been asking for the last couple of years, really. They were the ones that were really driving the tax offset, which the Liberal government announced previously and is now coming into effect. They've also been championing the return of that fund, which they now have. So they have got what they've kind of been asking for. But if you look at it, and it wasn't just in the games industry, I saw this across pretty much everywhere I get press releases from, statements from the theatre groups and all of the rest. The general sentiment of the overall package was that it is a good one in the sense that it does show that the government is willing to invest in the arts again, that we have this 116-page document of genuine effort, and that was all good. But now, what comes next? And I think the games industry is another one that will have a what comes next. And I'm sure there'll be some kind of next cause that IGA needs to fight for.
Well, it will be interesting to see what comes next. Thanks so much for making the time for joining us today, Matt. Now, you've been on the show before. You know what you're about to face. The Vertical Hold patented 3 questions of doom. I will ask all 3, and you can answer them in any order you like. But just let me get through all 3.
Rightio.
Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And a very Matt-specific question. If you could name one video game that you reckon not enough people have played, what would it be?
Good grief. I'm on digitallydownloaded.net, not .com. That doesn't go anywhere, I don't know. I don't think. .net. My Twitter is Matt Sains B, but I don't recommend you follow me on that, as anybody who does follow me would know. And in terms of a game, wow, that's a tough question.
I like tough questions.
Okay, can I say Cult of the Lamb? I mean, I know it did fairly well, but it is an Australian game, and while it did well with the gamers, I don't think it quite hit the mainstream that the Goose Game did. So I'm going to say Cult of the Lamb. Everybody should play that for sure.
Everybody should definitely play Cult of the Lamb. Thanks so much for your time, Matt.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Adam Turner. You might know me from such podcasts as Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. Go to verticalhold.com.au and you'll find links to a whole heap of podcasting platforms. Now, back to the show.
So, Lee, the Samsung Galaxy S23, S23 Plus, and S23 Ultra are the big news of the week. We kind of knew they were coming. But before we dive into the details, earlier on, I caught up with Telside's Fouad Fadaghi at the launch to see what impressed him about Samsung's latest offerings. So I'm just fresh out of a media briefing on the new Samsung Galaxy S23 phones that were announced earlier this week, and I'm chatting with Fouad Fadaghi from Telside, lead analyst there. So Fouad, what do you think of the phones, just generally in terms of what Samsung's done here?
I think it's a very strong product that they're putting out today. I think the most important thing for Samsung is really how they attract their customers from 2-3 years ago, and whether or not they will purchase the latest model, because previous models are available. It's all about the increments and showing value to a customer who's got an older handset from 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I think it definitely ticks the boxes for anyone who's looking to upgrade in the Android environment from a number of years ago.
That number of years figure is kind of interesting because, early on in smartphones, we definitely saw that kind of, you've got to upgrade to the latest model from last year's. Mm. Do you see much of that in the market anymore, or is it all that 3-4 year cycle?
Look, I think in the premium end, you definitely still get a lot of that, people upgrading on an annual basis. There's hardware as a service offerings, there's other kind of deals for people, and there's also, the smart buyer who will resell their handset after 12 months and pay the difference, if you like, to get a new handset. So, certainly that exists. But I think the key is for any manufacturer is to really get a customer from a handful of years ago and show them something that's worth more than what they've already got. And that difference in price and maybe an upgrade or a trade-in.
And I guess that jumps around. One of the things that I noticed with the new handsets, especially compared to last year's, is visually they're very, very similar. There's not a lot of design change to look at them, is there?
Well, look, the form factor of the smartphone hasn't changed from the small ones to the large ones. That was really the main thing that we've seen. We've seen, obviously, the foldable devices come out, which, present some challenges for Samsung, obviously, because, when they launch a new non-foldable model, it always gets compared with the foldable models. So, look, it is very similar. I think some of the colors are different, but I think the educated consumer today is looking at other things such as battery life and camera quality when they're upgrading, not necessarily just the design.
So on the camera front, this is obviously a big push for Samsung. How important is that camera story in the premium space, do you think?
I think it's very important, particularly in light of some of the negative press around their main competitor in Apple and their still camera performance. You know, we hear about Google doing some exceptional things with computational photography and so forth. So I think, you know, for Samsung, it presents a clear opportunity to stand out from its competitors. And by all counts, I think this model definitely does that, especially when you look at the night photography and some of the other cool sort of niche photography features it has.
So one of the claims that Samsung made during the briefing we just had, which somewhat surprised me actually, was that an increasing percentage, and I forget the number off the top of my head, but an increasing percentage of the Australian smartphone market is in that premium space. And I would have thought, looking at retail, you see so many more of, like for Samsung, their cheaper A-series phones, but also the likes of your Motorola's and your Oppos and your other mid-range and budget offerings. Does that claim gel with what you see in the market as an analyst?
I think so, yeah. Generally it does. We do see Australia as a market where consumers are primarily investing in premium handsets and keeping them for a longer period of time. We do see a lot of competition in the lower end space, but not the kind of loyalty that the bigger brands like Samsung, Apple, and possibly Oppo are looking for in a customer. So it makes sense for them to really target the high end, given that they deal with the lower end customer often with a 1 or 2 year old products.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned foldables, of course. This is, I suppose, a nice problem for Samsung to have. You can buy a premium foldable off them, or you can buy a premium standard smartphone. But often it's kind of the Australian market seems to be viewed as this kind of binary thing of it's Apple, then Samsung, then all the rest.
That's been the case for a while, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that'll continue? I mean, do you see
look, absolutely. There's no reason why it wouldn't. I think Google is the wild card in the equation here in terms of the Pixel offering. But Pixel hasn't generally done well in Australia, especially not in proportion to, say, how it's done in the States or in other markets. So, look, I think, this is a critical release for Samsung. They haven't dropped the ball by any means with their, slate format. And it'll be interesting to see how this product continues to sell throughout the year once they announce newer foldable devices in the second half of the year.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So, Lee, I know you've had some hands-on time. I've had some hands-on time with the new Galaxy S23 phones, and I wanted to really focus in on the S23 Ultra because it's the king of the hill. And there's a few bits of the tech that we sort of couldn't assess, but which sound interesting. They're wrapped in Corning Gorilla Glass Victus 2. They've got the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor. Is that enough to get your tingly bits tingling?
Not really. Mostly because a lot of the stuff in there is just going to be the same as everyone else. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is across even the smaller models, the S23 and S23 Plus, and pretty much every major phone this year is going to have that chip. So none of that
Apart
really.
From Huawei.
Oh, okay, great. So not Huawei. Okay, so pretty much every other Android phone that actually does get released in Australia and has an audience that actually cares about it will have that chip. I'm never getting Huawei to talk to me again, am I? But there's not a lot of excitement. I mean, they focused most of this event and most of the features on the camera. The camera is the big deal. They haven't changed the 5G. It's still sub-6 only in this country. There's really not a lot of difference about it. It's mostly like it on the S23 and S23 Plus, slightly bigger battery and the new chip. Even the camera has largely stayed the same. But on the S23 Ultra, as you said, they added a new sensor. Now, I went back and looked.
For those who haven't caught up, Lee, give us the 20-second version of what cameras the Ultra now has.
Oh, sure. So the S23 Ultra has a 200 megapixel camera. It is a massive camera. Effectively, it's a 200 megapixel camera. That's a standard wide f1.7 camera. So the standard camera that you would normally get on your phone is just a bigger sensor, much larger in general. It probably won't give you 200 megapixels at all times. You can use that mode, but it's primarily supposed to give you a better quality version of 12 or 50 megapixels, and that will come alongside a I'm trying to remember the exact ones on there. There's a 10 megapixel telephoto at 3x, a 10 megapixel 10x telephoto, and a 12 megapixel ultra wide, which is largely the same as last year's.
So 200 megapixels just sounds stupid. We're just going to say a bazillion megapixels. Why does anyone need a 200 megapixel camera phone, and can it actually do that?
So the answer is yes, it can actually do that. And this is the second 200 megapixel sensor Samsung has made. They kind of expected, or everyone expected in the tech community, for it to be in last year's model, and it wasn't. So it's kind of like the first ISOCELL HP was just never released, I guess. So the new 200...
I have this feeling it made it into like a random Xiaomi phone only for the Chinese market.
That's right. They had an agreement with Xiaomi, and I think it might have been one of the Leica models, but it's not been... It wasn't really promoted.
For sure. Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And no one really spoke about it. But this new one is improved because I think, from what I understand, the pixel binning capability. So 200 megapixels. It's an obscene amount, and it plays... You remember, I mean, you both have been in journalism and technology journalism longer than I have. So the megapixel wars and the whole megapixel myth would have easily come up several times over in your career. The idea being that more megapixels does not make a better camera, clearly. What Samsung is doing here is to try and, I guess, extrapolate a better image by cutting down the image. So they did this with the 108 megapixel camera in the previous models, where they would cut it down to a 27 megapixel image. Basically, every pixel was worth 4 pixels, effectively.
So this is pixel binning, isn't it? Oh,
exactly. This is pixel binning. So there are 2 modes. There's a 50 megapixel one, which pixel bins at 4 times, the same way the 108 did to 27. And there's a pixel binning of 12 megapixels, and that pixel bins at 16. And that's particularly interesting. If Samsung can pull off more light in that way, it essentially turns that 200 megapixel sensor into a medium capable of getting a lot of light in. Now, the problem with this is that no one has actually tested it from our hands-on. The testing was really limited at what you could do. Samsung is talking about, I hate the term, they call it nightography. It's low-light photography.
It's a terrible marketing term.
It's a terrible marketing term. And it's not really astrophotography either. It's just capturing low-light images. But the theory is if they can capture in low light really remarkably well, you'll get those lovely pictures of the stars, northern lights, all that sort of fun stuff. Again, no one's really tested it. It's a lot of hype, and megapixels doesn't necessarily make the better image on a camera. The iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max both have 48 megapixel sensor, and they downsized a pixel bin at 4 as well, so back to 12 megapixels, and they work incredibly well. So it doesn't necessarily matter that there's 200 megapixels. It has to be a good sensor as well, and we don't know if that's the case.
They are doing some interesting things, and you're right. The demo, the hands-on, we were in different sessions, but I think we probably had much the same experience. But the hands-on did show me a couple of things which I thought were interesting, and I'm guessing more relate to the way they post-process the images.
Yeah.
So, for example, they showed off a night portrait selfie mode, and that's off that front, and I'm going to say I think it's a 12 megapixel front
sensor. It's 12
f2.2,
and I don't think it's changed from last year.
But they showed off a night portrait mode, which seemed, off a single shot, very small sample size, and I haven't independently tested it either, but it seemed to do pretty well under the circumstances. So they might, being the operative word here, they might be onto something, especially in that competitive space. Because, I mean, you mentioned Apple, but who else do you rate for that low-light night photography that's such a cornerstone of the flagship phone experience right now?
The only two I actually have typically rated, and it wasn't Samsung, was Google's Pixel 7 Pro and the iPhone range. And for what it's worth, Google's Pixel range has long been quite good for night modes. I mean, they were one of the first ones to actually get the star photography right. I think it was in the Pixel 5 and higher. And Apple has been there for a while because it also had the Pixel Shift technology that it had in the 12 when it migrated to the 13 as well.
But with the Pixel phones, are they actually taking better photos, or are they using Google's AI to look at an average photo and go, oh, this is how we should fix it?
It's a really good question that I don't have a great answer for you on. My gut feeling it's a combination of both.
That's what I thought.
The cameras are good, but Google Smarts, I mean, you look at the fact that even, I looked at the Pixel 3a a few weeks ago. It's an old phone, but but it could do fantastic portraits because that AI was just so solid. So Google's understanding of software smarts really helps propel it in ways a lot of companies don't do. Also worth noting is that the chip it uses, which is actually completely different, it undermines everything I said earlier. It'll be the only brand, not Huawei, using its own hardware. It won't be using a Qualcomm at all. Their Tensor chips are based off similar hardware to what they use in their search, in their servers for their search. So it can do a little bit more from a neural capability, and that might give it a bit of an edge in processing as well.
The issue that older Google Pixel phones admittedly used to have with night mode is they'd make these kind of spectacular things, but they were so clearly AI-led because I used to describe it as a kind of crayon effect. It was just the colors were too oversaturated for what it tried to do. And it's backed off from that. It's gotten smarter. The AI learns. Who could have guessed that?
Well, the model got better anyway.
The other factor where I guess, and again, this is as yet untested, and I certainly didn't get an opportunity, and maybe you did, which is why I'm bringing it up. The other area I guess that 200 megapixel sensor might have a positive effect is with, warning, incoming terrible Samsung marketing term, space zoom. They're 100 times zoom.
No.
Because a bunch of that is...
Isn't it? Space zoom!
I
think I can get you a job with Samsung.
That's
Adam.
amazing.
My dog just lost his mind upstairs.
but that's partially a telephoto zoom and partially a crop off that large sensor. It might help, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, space zoom is a weird one. Partly because it's hard to control, and the other part because it's just cropping. Like the digital zoom is a really weird one. It's a reminder of why I didn't like video cameras for the longest time. When every company, do you remember those Panasonic trips we would go on, and they would advertise 300x zoom, but it would be completely useless because it was all cropped and you couldn't control it. That's the problem I have with space zoom. 3x is going to be useful. 10x will be and 10x actually looks quite stable. Granted, it's only at f4.9, which means it's not going to be useful in low light at all, unless the sensor is mind-blowingly amazing. But that extra zoom that you can crop down on the 200 megapixel, look, it is theoretically possible it could work well. I just don't know, because even on the 108, it wasn't astounding. It was essentially AI and software helping blow up an image, and the result was still soft, and when it wasn't soft, not fantastic to look at. It is kind of good at recreating basic details on buildings, but that was largely where I got to. I know even on the moon, it's a really interesting one. I still don't know whether the moonshot I was getting was legitimately correct or whether the AI was kind of cheating a bit.
Well, look, did they hide the moon men and their cheese? That's the question you've got to ask there. What I used to find with prior Samsung space zoom phones, and now I can't help myself, was that above about 30 times, it just wasn't worth doing. No. But you could get more than the 10 times that they had with reasonable kind of results. So I guess we will have to wait and see there. You mentioned that it's not just the Ultra. We've got the S23 and the S23 Plus. And I will say from the offset, I find it hard to get excited. I find it hard to recommend them massively unless you really wanted a small, powerful phone, which is what the S23 is.
Yeah, I find it underwhelming. I'm really confused by it. They strike me as responses to the iPhone 14 rather than actual follow-ups to the S22, because they are basically the S22 and S22 Plus. Very little has changed about them. The battery's gotten better, and marginally better by 200 milliamps on either one. And there's a new chip. It's really hard to get excited about a phone that is basically a rehash of last year, when Apple did the same thing with the iPhone 14, and many of us were critical of that. There was a better front-facing camera, but that was kind of it. Those ones seem like the least exciting ones, and I don't quite know how they're being released without as much, I don't know, excitement or emphasis or zhuzh. I mean, the argument could be that you get things like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and that's got other things like it's got support for spatial audio when the new earphones come in, like head tracking spatial audio and Android. That'll be exciting, kind of, but there's very little to get excited about those. And again, I've not seen a lot of difference in the camera. So if the camera is the main reason to get excited, this is the thing that really bothered me about the S23 and S23 Plus. They replaced the 108 megapixel sensor on the Ultra. Great, okay. They should have trickled that into the S23 and S23 Plus. That should have been the obvious, upgrade. The fact that it no longer exists means that the S23 and S23 Plus are basically just last year's models. And that really bothers me because they had this great sensor. They could have said the S23 Ultra has the brand new one, but we're moving this still fantastic chip from last year into the older models, or into the newer, smaller models, and that would have been a great update. But instead, they just left last year's stuff in there, and I'm really deeply confused by that.
Well, that probably poses a good question then. Looking across this range, who should be thinking about upgrading, and is it worth chucking last year's model in the bin to get one of these?
No way.
Hell no.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. So how far back would you go? Which phone would you have to own before you? Assuming you were a Samsung Galaxy person,
yeah.
How far back would you have to own that phone before you'd say, yeah, give it to your mum or chuck it in the bin and buy a new one?
See, the 108 megapixel was still on the S20, if I recall. So it's been around for a few years now. That was when Space Zoom first popped up, I think. Correct me wrong. S21 or S20?
I want to say the 21, but that is off the top of my head on very little sleep. I think what you're getting at, and I think I would concur, that the smart way to do these kinds of upgrades is about 3+ years.
Yeah. And it was the S20, by the way. That had
it was the S20. Okay,
that had Space Zoom, so that means the 108 was on that. But yeah, I think S20 you're probably approaching an upgrade makes sense, but even the 108 on that is still fairly capable. I think anything before then is probably a valid upgrade path if you love your Samsung. Keep in mind, in that time between the S20, S21, S22, and now S23, like S22 and S23 Ultra both had the pen. Great. That was fantastic. That was something that range needed. There were notes around at that time. So if you have a phone that still has the word note in it, now might be the time to update. That's probably an upgrade path.
Yeah, especially if you kept the Note 7 for some reason. But as was discussing with Fowed earlier in the show, Samsung reckons an awful lot of their revenue, not just the large numbers, but the actual numbers of phones sold, are in this premium space. So people are buying and upgrading. But I do still think that sensible play is to get 3+ years, unless the only argument I guess I could see for upgrading from last year's model is if you knew that you absolutely could sell last year's model for a reasonable sum towards this year's model. That whole upgrade path is not the most ludicrous if you're willing to take that hit in cost. I don't personally think it's worth it, but for those who feel like they must have the latest and greatest, if you're not on a contract or whatever.
It'd be a good test to see if Samsungs hold their value. We know iPhones can hold their value a lot better than a lot of other brands, but I find it hard to believe a Samsung would, especially given how many models Samsung releases in the space of a year. And also the confusing point for me, and I made this point to one of the executives at the Samsung briefing, all the money in the world tells me to spend it on the Galaxy Fold models, the Z Fold models, and yet they lack the best cameras in the range. And it's super confusing and disheartening to know that if you spend the most money on the most impressive Samsung phone, you won't get the best cameras on the other one. And it's so weird.
I think it's deliberate. I think it's very much
it's totally deliberate.
The S series is our camera line. The foldable series is our foldable line because, of course, they don't have the notes as that slightly later in the year refresh as well. They're basically saying we do 2 flagship refreshes a year. And
They should be combined. The very fact that you're spending so much money on what is ostensibly the same phone with a foldable screen should get you those really expensive cameras, but it doesn't. And it didn't last year, and it probably won't this year.
So speaking of probably won't this year, the other thing they announced at Galaxy Unpacked were new Galaxy Book laptops. And I say they announced them because they announced them to the international media, but at the Australian media briefings, they were conspicuously absent, weren't they, ladies?
Yeah, we didn't see them. In fact, when we saw the press kit, the fact that they were in there was like, oh, would have been nice for a warning. That would have been handy. Galaxy Books are weird, and I know LG's entered this area, re-entered this area, and Samsung goes back and forth in Australia.
The Gram, I think it is, for LG?
Yeah. And I was like, Samsung goes back and forth in Australia in this area all the time. I think in the S20 or S21, they relaunched it, and they came back. It goes all the time. I don't know if it would make a big dent in Australia. I don't know. Maybe they've just given up on the laptop market here, or maybe they're going to wait to the middle of the year. I don't really know. Does anyone buy a Samsung laptop?
Well, presumably somebody did at some point, but maybe very few people did, and that's why they're not at least announcing them here. Doesn't mean, as you say, that they can't do so. I guess we will have to wait and see. Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Lee for joining us again.
Thank you, guys.
And Lee, you've been here many, many times. You know what's coming. The Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom.
Well, it works with the space zoom thing we did earlier.
Exactly. I might have to adopt it permanently now. But I guess I should get on with the questions, which, as always, I will ask all 3, and then you can answer them in any order you like, although nearly everyone answers them in the order I ask them. Funny that.
Crazy.
Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And a one-time special big Lee-centric contentious question. What's the one bit of camera or photography advice you'd give to consumers above all others?
Oh, wow. It wasn't a question about Babylon 5 or Star Trek Enterprise. I was genuinely bracing myself for a horrible question. What were the questions again? You can find me on the internet, on Twitter at at Lilo, and at Picker, www.picker.com.au, where I'm apparently an independent journo. And the best piece of photography advice I can give someone is actually to find something that fits comfortably in your hand. That is actually it seems crazy. It doesn't matter what you're using, your phone or a proper camera. Find something you're comfortable with, that you can easily shoot on and not feel weird about. Everyone has the idea that a big camera is going to make a better image. That's not true. Just find something you're comfortable with that fits in your hand perfectly, and you'll take great pictures because you'll be comfortable at all times.
Sound advice. And as always, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter for as long as Twitter remains around, at the Vertical Hold Facebook page for as long as Meta doesn't go broke, and on the web at verticalhold.com.au.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Don't forget to drop us a line, tell us what you love about the show, and maybe tell us what we could do better in 2023.
The sign over here says, if Lee says something about Enterprise again, he gets an axe.
Adam, I told you to hide that sign.